Greetings, class. Today we'll be discussing the end of the Great War and how, after 4 bloody years of fighting, World War One finally comes to an end in 1918. We're also going to investigate the Paris Peace Conference, which was where the leaders of the victorious nations met after the war and attempted to create a peace plan that would prevent future terrible conflicts from occurring. But sadly, because of the decisions made at this peace conference, the stage would ultimately be set for an even larger war to take place several decades later in World War II. Now, after acting as a neutral nation for the majority of World War I, the United States finally enters this conflict in 1917 on the side of the Allied powers. This is a huge boost to the Allied powers because the United States was the largest industrial country in the world. They had a ton of resources, a lot of weapons, and a lot of soldiers that they could use to fight against the Central Powers in Germany, who were starting to run out of resources after fighting this terrible stalemate war for 3+ years. So the U.S. joining was a major turning point. Why does the United States choose to join with the Allied powers? It really came down to two main reasons. One was the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, which upset many Americans and turned them against Germany. And the other big factor was that Germany decided to resume its practice of unrestricted submarine warfare, which led to the death of many Americans. This also enraged the United States, and it ultimately made the president and Congress feel like their hand was forced and that they had to join the side of the Allied powers. They couldn't just sit back and be neutral anymore. Early on into the United States' entrance into the war, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, who's pictured here to the left on the slide, is going to deliver a speech to Congress that becomes pretty famous. The speech discusses Wilson's vision for a post-war world and what needed to be done to create an everlasting peace and a just society. He essentially identified 14 things. He said, if you do these 14 things, and every country does these 14 things, then there'd be no reason to fight wars anymore, and we could live in a world where there was no more war. Since he had 14 ideas for creating peace, the speech became known as the 14 Points Speech, where each point represents one of the ideas for creating this everlasting peace. And this speech was very popular when he gave it, and it sort of inspires, not sort of, it does, it inspires the imaginations of many people around the globe who'd become tired and weary of fighting this terrible conflict. In particular, it was awfully appealing for Germany. Many Germans, especially German civilians, could kind of tell that the war was starting to turn against them at this point in 1918, and that they were going to surrender. They'd like to surrender with the best possible terms for peace, where they're being blamed for the least amount of stuff and have the least amount of punishments to face. And a lot of the ideas in the 14 points were appealing to Germany because it'd take it easy on the side that lost the war. What are some of these peacekeeping strategies, these peace ideas that were in the 14 points? Well, one is no more secret alliances. Wilson identified that alliances were one of the main causes for the war. So we want to get rid of these. Another one was to get rid of submarine warfare. It makes sense that an American president would want to end this, since the American economy and American citizens had been heavily damaged by submarine warfare during the war. So he wanted to bring back freedom of the seas by getting rid of submarines. The third thing he wanted to do, another thing he wanted to do, was to remove economic barriers like tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. And he felt this would lead to economic growth for all kinds of countries if these were removed. He also wanted to try and end militarism by forcing countries to reduce the size of their military and their navies. He started to appreciate a lot of the claims that colonies had for independence. European powers had these massive empires and colonies throughout the globe, and a lot of these colonies were going through nationalism and were beginning to demand their independence. And so Wilson essentially says that if a colony wants to be independent, they should be given the opportunity to become independent, if not immediately, then eventually gradually over time. But out of all the 14 points, the idea that was the most meaningful to Wilson, he thought was the most important to create this lasting peace, was the creation of an international peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. The League of Nations would function by having representatives from each country meet, and instead of fighting out and debating or fighting their issues out in the battlefield, the representatives could debate these issues and use diplomacy to solve their problems. And this would be the key thing that was used to prevent future wars. So these are some of the ideas from Wilson's 14-point speech. But the most important idea from them to Wilson was the creation of this peacekeeping organization, the League of Nations. But before peace could be achieved, Germany had to be defeated. Um, After Russia had been knocked out of the war in 1917 and they became the Soviet Union, Germany was able to take its troops that were fighting on the Eastern Front and they could move them to the Western Front. Remember, Germany had been fighting a two-front war. Basically, had been fighting both to its east and to its west. West against Britain and France, east against Russia. But now that Russia was out, they could take all their troops and use it to defend themselves and also attack their rivals on the Western Front. And they used this huge increase in troops to launch a massive assault, an invasion into France in the spring of 1918. The goal of this invasion was that they would push so far into French territory that they would eventually capture the capital of France, which is Paris, which would essentially knock France out of the war if they lost their capital. And the Germans came awfully close to being successful with this plan. They got within 12 miles of the capital, Paris, but because of U.S. reinforcements in the shape of soldiers, food, weapons, and just like general war materials, the Allied powers were able to stop this massive German invasion, halt it, and actually started their own counteroffensive where they began to push Germany back out of France and then into Germany. And so now Germany was on its heels and it was retreating. While this was going on, German civilians that weren't fighting but were in the home front were also being impacted. Britain was continuing its blockade, and as a result, there was no food coming into Germany, and the economy was lacking many resources needed to thrive. And so people were losing money, people were starving. And so a lot of German civilians were becoming disenchanted with this war, and they started to listen to the ideas that were coming from the 14-point speech and started to view surrender with a more positive view and were more willing to consider surrendering at this point. Eventually, when things were getting very, very grim and Germany had lost its allies and was close to starving to death, an armistice is going to be signed. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. So it's not a peace treaty. It's just like we're going to stop fighting so we can begin to negotiate a peace treaty. And the World War I armistice was signed on a pretty unique date. It was signed by the German powers at the 11th hour during the 11th day of the 11th month, which is November of 1918. So it's signed in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It's kind of a unique symbolic date for this to be signed. As a result, today, every November 11th, people in Europe celebrate Armistice Day. And in the United States, every November 11th, we celebrate Veterans Day to commemorate all those that died and fought in this terrible war. Now that the war had ended and Germany had surrendered, it was time to start creating a peace agreement. But before we get to that, really it's important to kind of consider the cost of this war. The cost of this war was staggeringly high. Over 10 million soldiers were killed and 21 million soldiers were wounded. Or 21 million people in general were wounded. So that's soldiers and civilians. And as you can see by the graph on the right here, Russia and Germany suffered the most. Those are the two countries that had the most people that were killed, the highest number of casualties, and were most devastated by this war. In some countries that participated in World War I, it seemed as if almost entire generations of young men were gone because they went and they were drafted and they fought and they were killed. And so the legacy of this war will last a long time because so many people died, and it's going to heavily impact the development of their countries. Along with all the people that were killed and injured from the war is also insanely expensive. Over $300 billion in damages are accumulated as a result of financial losses during the war. So it was devastating from a human standpoint and also from a financial standpoint, this fighting. $300 billion. Now that the war had ended and the armistice had been signed, it was time to start kind of ironing out the details and actually creating the official peace treaty that would officially end the war. And the Allies countries that won the war faced the task of devising and creating this peace agreement. The leaders of the major victorious Allied countries ended up meeting in 1918 at the famous Palace of Versailles. This was the epic palace created by Louis XIV. And throughout history, many peace treaties have been created and signed here. This meeting became known as the Paris Peace Conference, since the Palace of Versailles is located just outside of Paris. 4 strong leaders ended up dominating most of the discussions of this meeting. These leaders were President Woodrow Wilson from the United States, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. They were known as the Big Four because they're the 4 people that kind of dominate how this treaty is going to be created. The Peace Conference had a long list of problems that it had to solve, and it experienced issues with solving them right from the very beginning. The biggest issue that they faced was that this peace conference actually excluded many of the belligerent nations that had fought in the war, and they were not allowed to participate in the negotiations that took place at the conference. So a lot of countries that lost weren't even given a seat at the table to determine what the final resolutions were going to be. Representatives from the defeated Central Powers, including Germany, were given no role at all in these peace discussions. And the newly created communist country of the Soviet Union, or the country formerly called Russia, wasn't invited either to the peace conference because the Big Four leaders were terrified that if the Russians were brought in, it would lead to the expansion and the spread of communism. So they basically just ignored the Russians. Now, to make matters worse, the goals of each of the Big Four leaders contradicted each other. Woodrow Wilson, as promised in his 14-point address, tried hard to write a treaty that would be fair for all countries involved. But the other European powers, whose nations had experienced much greater loss than that of the United States during the war, were not forgiving at all, and they wanted to place harsh punishments on Germany, whom they blamed for starting the entire conflict. The Big Four also had to deal with other political problems that were taking place in the globe at this point. Many of the defeated countries that had lost the war experienced political changes and were transforming from monarchies, where they had one autocratic ruler, to new democratic republics. And so they were struggling to kind of identify what kind of government they wanted to be and where their borders were going to be for these new states. Additionally, a lot of ethnic groups that were living within the countries that had been defeated during the war continued to demand and to continue to press for the right of self-determination, which is the ability to create your own nation and govern it how you see fit. And then also, finally, many nations, they're going to have colonies that are going to continue to demand their independence. And what do you do with these colonies? Do you set them free? Do the countries that won the war get to take control of these colonies? Do you let Germany and its allies keep their colonies? This was a major debate, too, that the Big Four had to figure out how they wanted to solve. And that kind of ties into the conflicting territorial demands. What do you do with all the land that you get from Germany being defeated? And then one final great debate that took place was reparations. Reparations are payments for war damages. So when a country fights a war and they lose, often they have to pay reparations to pay for all the damage that was caused by the war because they lost. Essentially, many Allied leaders felt that Germany had started the war and had in essence broken the continent because they started a war where there's tons of destruction. And since Germany broke it, they felt they should pay for it. And they demanded that Germany pay these reparations to pay for all the damages they believed it caused during the war. These reparations were super unfair. And it's pretty clear that Germany was not the only country to blame for this war starting. And so they were unfair, and they'd be impossible for Germany to repay without having major damage done to their economy that would set them back a long time. So this was a huge debate. Do you make Germany pay these reparations? And the Allied powers eventually decided at this peace conference that they would make Germany pay these terrible reparations that were highly unfair. And so those are all major debates that happened. One thing that will be created at the peace conference was this League of Nations, the 14th point of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And so this peacekeeping international organization will be created to help prevent future conflicts and to use diplomacy. And it was meant to be one of the more positive things from these peace negotiations. So the League will be created as a result of these meetings. Now, the goal of this peace conference in Paris was to create a peace that would last many, many years after all the chaos that was caused by World War One. But what kind of peace would it create? It became pretty clear early on in the negotiations that the Big Four had conflicting viewpoints regarding the peace treaty that they were creating. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson believed that the settlement, this peace agreement, should be fair and it should not be harsh to the countries that lost, since if it was, it would create resentment from those countries toward the Allied powers, and that it could possibly eventually lead to future wars. This differed from the other four Allied countries, the other three that were part of the Big Four, since those countries felt extreme hatred toward Germany. And they blamed Germany for starting the conflict in the first place, and they felt that Germany should be punished for doing so. Britain, France, and Italy all wanted to divide Germany and to take its resources from them, as well as from its Central Power allies. And they wanted to make sure that Germany never became strong enough to ever again be able to launch another war against them. And so you have Wilson, who's trying to create peace and a just and equal treaty. And the other three big leaders from Italy, France, and Britain are pretty much just out for revenge and trying to get as much as they can from the Central Powers as a result of winning. In the end, the future of Germany and also that of all of world history will be determined by many of the fateful decisions made at this conference in Paris. And sadly, the results of these decisions will not be positive and will lead to an even bigger, more devastating world war in 2 decades.